It's important to note that in the history of women in the United States, that there's been many, many, many advances. While we would argue that it is still an oppressed group, there are some things that we should definitely recognize as great accomplishments for women as well as for the American society in general. Just a few highlights that we have for women's American history is that in 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held. This was held in Seneca Falls, and it was the first time that women had really gotten together and started to discuss the rights that they felt that they deserved to have, which included women's suffrage. There was men and women alike at this conference, and it really began what we would later just see the women's rights movement as well as women's suffrage. In 1869, the National Women's Suffrage Association was created by Susan B. Anthony. This organization was charged and hoped to accomplish getting women the right to vote. This was a first large mobilization that we saw and a true organization formed. In 1916, Margaret Sanger opened the first birth control in Brooklyn, New York. It was only open for a few short days, but Margaret Sanger would continue later on in her life to be one of the pioneers when it came to giving women the right to choose. So this was a great accomplishment. In 1920, we see that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution is passed, giving women the right to vote, which was a huge step and definitely an accomplishment for all those that had worked so hard for women's suffrage in the years prior. In 1935, the National Council of Negro Women was established, and this was really not only to fight racism, but a huge component of their mission was also to fight sexism. So you'll see, as we talk about African American women and sexism and how crucial that is, this organization is a huge pioneer in ending that sexism and racism intertwined. Next in history, we see in 1961, President John F. Kennedy created the President's Commission on the Status of Women. It was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. And this commission, through their findings, they discussed the lower wages that women receive. They discussed the treatment of women in the workplace and a variety of other things, as well as gave a few tidbits and hints on how they could go in towards and improve. This commission, while it wasn't necessarily something that established work or legislation, it did establish the need for these things to be looked into and for legislation and actions to be taken from it. So having that commission, having it chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, was a huge step in women's history. In 1963, The Feminine Mystique was released it was written by Betty Friedan. And this book, it was talking about the middle class woman's dissatisfaction with staying home and being the house mother and really taking care of the home, and kind of how women felt that they were moving past that. This book was a huge controversy because it really put into the public eye that these housewives were unhappy and they felt like that they could accomplish so much more. And it really was an empowerment tool for those women that maybe didn't know that they felt that way, but it was definitely an avenue for them to explore how they were feeling and how they could go from there. Next big piece is in 1967, we see Executive Order 11375 expanded so that gender is included as an oppressed component of affirmative action, saying that you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender. We see that a lot of times in the workplace and in the community, women are discriminated against based on their gender, but this expansion of the executive order made that so it's not legal to do so. In 1972, we have Title IX passing. A lot of people, especially in college, they see that Title IX is the reason why we have to have this many women's sports versus this many men's sports. But in general, this was just banning sex discrimination in a school setting, meaning that it couldn't be athletics, it couldn't be academics, it couldn't be anything. So Title IX was a huge proponent in opening the doors of education to women so that they're in an environment where they feel like they can truly excel in every way that their male counterparts can. In 1978, we see the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. This has a lot to do with women in the workplace not being able to be fired or discriminated against if they are pregnant while they're working. So for women in general, this was a huge push, and a huge accomplishment, just because we don't want to see women have to choose between being a wife and a mother and having a career and being successful. And then the last one that we wanted to talk about was in 1994, the Violence Against Women Act. This really, when we talk about the oppressed group of women, we talk about physical violence, we think about verbal violence, in any way that the dominant masculine power can hold power over women. And this Violence Against Women Act was a huge step in the right direction in preventing actions like that being taken on women and taking that level of oppression and power of control away. So women's history is very, very rich. There's been so many accomplishments in the past years, but there's always more that we can do.